I'm recording to the cloud and Sven is recording to his computer. Okay, so we can make a proper start. And again, just to welcome you, it's lovely to have you here. Sven's been working on this for a while and we've been in conversation about it and I'm really looking forward to it. I'm Annette, I'm a psychotherapist and spiritual director. And Sven and I met on a course run by Jem Bendel and Katie Carr last summer. And it only happened that way because we were supposed to meet in person and that had to be cancelled. It went online and Sven was able to Zoom in from Germany, whereas I'm in the UK. And we just got chatting and we've been chatting ever since. And I now know more about biophysics than I ever learned at school. And I've been saying to Sven, he's got a real gift for imparting it to people like me who really haven't got that kind of scientific background or real leaning in towards science. So I've been really grateful. And then I think he's quite enjoyed talking to me. We come from such different perspectives. I'm all about the sort of psychological, spiritual. He's all about the science. And we found a really interesting kind of meeting place. So I think you're in for a treat. And I think he's got a real facility as a teacher of these things. Just to let you know the vague outline of this, we're going to have a quiet moment before we start. We felt it was important just to acknowledge the sort of more interior aspect of ourselves before we then launch into quite a heady lecture. So we'll be doing that very briefly just now. Then Sven's got a lecture that's about an hour long. It might go a bit over that. And then hopefully we'll have time at the end for whatever questions you have. There's enough information here to fill a university module, for something between 3 months and a year. There's a lot of info, which is why I'm hoping it's going to be helpful that we're recording it so you can choose to go back and kind of reconnect with bits if you want to. Yeah, I think is that it, Sven? Have I covered what I needed to cover? Yeah. Okay, so before we hand over to Sven, let's just take a moment to check in more interiorly. We really learned this with the combination of Jem and Katie Carr. I don't know if any of you know them, some of you will. And it's just such a good combination of the more academic, heady stuff with the stuff that Katie does, which is all about checking in and being aware of how we are when we come to an encounter like this, or any encounter. So if it helps, you can close your eyes. And first of all, just kind of relax into your chair. Notice how your body is, where it might be holding some tension. The kind of sense of expectation of the lecture we're about to hear. You might come with a lot of background, you might come with none. So just sense into how your body feels about that. And to the extent that there's any tension or maybe anxiety or whatever you bring, it might not be about the lecture, whatever you've brought in with you, to offer it some kindness, some acceptance of how you are. And I love the work of Joanna Macy, and I'm remembering she always starts with encouraging us to feel gratitude. So even if you can name one thing as you sit here that you feel grateful for, it might be that you're here, or that you've got the capacity to listen and hear and see what's going to be offered. It might be the weather, it could be anything. So just check in with something about gratitude. And then just acknowledge any feelings you've brought in. Again, that might come in from outside. I mean, there's so much to have a lot of feelings about at the moment in our world. And those of us in the Deep Adaptation Forum know, are very familiar with that, and familiar with the importance of acknowledging our feelings. So again, just acknowledge what's there. And accept them, and be kind to yourself about whatever it is. And finally, to acknowledge our heads and our thoughts, our intelligence, of the intelligence of the head and the brain. And again, what have you brought with you? You might have lots of thoughts going on. You might not know what you've let yourself in for here. Just check in with your thoughts. And if there's stuff that you brought in that is a bit distracting, maybe just ask it to park itself somewhere to the side for the next hour or so. Maybe end just with a couple of deep breaths. Breathing in, breathing out. And then let's turn ourselves towards the lecture that Sven's prepared. Thanks, Sven. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Annette. That was really, really good. I'm really glad that you brought us to this space of a bit of calm and clarity. And I definitely could feel my heart beating quite a lot now. And also I'm very grateful for the opportunity to speak to you for an extended amount of time. So I'm going to try to start sharing my screen, and it should go like this. And then I would hope that there appears a energetics of collapse slide. Can everybody see? Is that visible? I guess.
Yeah, it's looking good.
Very good. All right. So as Annette said, there's a lot of stuff in the talk. And like almost every slide is more like a primer to expose you to a way of thinking and a set of ideas. But nevertheless, I think the talk has a logic that builds up to something that I hope is a meaningful contribution towards deep adaptation. It's a bit of a hybrid talk in the sense that it's made in mind for a general audience, but it does also speak to the deep adaptation idea directly. And so how do I, here we go. So it's basically in three parts. I mean, there'll be an introductory slide or two, and then there'll be a first part where we'll be talking about like a quantitative understanding of energy and like an exposition of the status quo that we're in currently in society. And then there will be a second part where it's more like a qualitative understanding of energetics in complex systems, and mainly naturally in society. And then the third part of like an integration of what that means for us right now and for in the future and for deep adaptation. So let's begin right away. So this is me when I try to look presentable. I have a diploma in chemistry. I studied chemistry in Germany and then went on to do a PhD in biophysics, where I studied the energetics of photosynthesis. So you can see here on the right, this is basically photosynthesis, and I studied this green blob. There are parts of this green blob. And so the questions I was asking is like, how does it work on a molecular basis? What's the energetics? Why does it fail sometimes? And like, what are the inefficiencies? And because, you know, it isn't perfect as a machine. And so these kind of questions led me or us very quickly to talk about like related problems or like problems that are related to like our predicament. And so we thought about biofuels and photosynthetic constraints on that, and I published also on like negative emissions technologies, and all of this is like part of, you know, going from the small and doing translational thinking about like bigger and bigger implications and bigger systems. until I guess in 2019, where there's a bit of a break, where I decided that science, as it is practiced today, is not a part of the solution for our problems, but more or less at the core of the problem. And I thought it's probably better to work for like Goldman Sachs or something than to stay in science, and so I quit. And I did quite a bit of activism with Extinction Rebellion. And then I would say since then I've been like more or less muddying about, and then now like this talk is one attempt of like using this knowledge in a better way than just in academia publishing papers. And so the talk's called Energetics of Collapse, but what it really is the energetics of complex systems. And so I've been studying organisms like the ones up top here, which are photosynthetic microorganisms. So they are a complex system. So what is a complex system? Basically, I mean, there's lots of definitions, but for now, it's really just a system composed of many interacting components that sits within a certain environment. And because it has these many different components, its behavior is quite difficult to model or to predict. You know, it's non-linear, there's feedback loop, it's kind of emergent adaptive. It's energy dissipating. That means basically only that it needs energy to function. And of course, as such, then it's bound by the laws of physics. And so this is quite a broad definition, and it applies, you know, to lots of different systems. So for example, microorganisms, but also humans are complex systems, and then entire societies. And you can go large and say that, you know, the entire planet is one big complex system. And you could, I guess, go even larger, but it becomes a bit difficult then, I would say. And so what I found out basically is that, you know, the laws that you find out in this kind of system are exactly the same for the rest. And so if you look at it more in like a model way, you have a complex system, and the boundaries are quite interesting. You know, where does it stop? And they're different, and they have implications. But then in general, it needs energy inputs, and it uses resources, and it produces wastes. And the purpose it does that for, like what it does with that, it does maintenance of itself and growth, right? So this is basically an idea of what a complex system is. And so there's many different ways to look at that, and many different disciplines that look at complex systems. And, you know, for example, when climate people, they look at the wastes, right? Economists maybe look at maintenance and growth, and resources, maybe, okay, that's ecologists or something like that. And it's I've looked at it like from this energy perspective. And so that's quite interesting. And I think it's a very important angle to look at complex systems. And so to go a bit further, we have to think about what is energy, right? Why is it even difficult to talk about energy, and why this talk is kind of necessary, I think, at least. And so the reason for that is that when we talk about energy as normal people, and we do it all the time because energy is everywhere, right? We use it in a certain way. For example, we could say, I jumped into a cold shower this morning and I feel really energetic. Or, you know, today I feel kind of low energy. And our normal use of the word energy implies certain rules and certain ways of what the word energy refers to. And that's totally fine. That is, there's no problem with that. The problem arises that, like, scientists, when they speak of energy, they use the same words, but the rules that exist are somehow different. And so, for example, you know, the sentence "good energy is contagious," it makes total sense, right? It is contagious. But then as a scientist, I go at this and I go like, energy, wait, you know, now suddenly there's good and bad. So there's a moral component to energy. And like for a scientist, that, you know, there's no moral component to energy. It's just energy. It's measured in joules, right? But then also it's contagious. And then we go like, oh, well, I mean, viruses might be contagious, but energy can't be contagious. That would be like, it's a categorical mistake. You know, it's like saying the music is yellow. It doesn't work for us, right? So there's different rules there. And so both these kind of ways of looking at energy or using the term energy are totally valid, but like problems arise when, you know, we use the rules of the one system to look at the other system. And so, you know, for example, here there's energy crystals, and like I, as a scientist, I really don't know what energy crystals would be. And furthermore, like there's a problem that like we currently live in an absolute like energy abundance, right? So there's so much energy that like for all the things that we use it, we don't really even notice. So you could say that like there's a fridge that we use every day and there's a TV and we don't really know how much energy that uses. And so from this discrepancy and this lack of knowledge about the scientific view of energy, then problems arise. And there's, for example, this is an image where it shows how much space photovoltaics for electricity demand of the world would take, of the European Union would take, or of Germany would take. And then we say, oh, it's a really, really small square. Look, it's just a little bit of, what is that, Algeria maybe, or Morocco. That should be no problem at all, right? But then from an energetics point of view, it's probably not true. And there's other things that we do that from an energetic point of view don't really make a lot of sense, where here, for example, we have biofuels in our fuels in Europe everywhere now. Or we say things in the media where like, oh, it's just these 20 companies that are responsible for a lot of carbon emissions. And like, can't we just get rid of these and then everything's good? Okay, so if our societal energy, concepts don't really work, so then let's face, or like let's look at what science says about energy. And then it's not really that simple either. It would be really nice if I could just give you the formula and we'd be done with it. But then, for example, David Hume in 1748 already said, there are no ideas more obscure and uncertain than those of power, force, energy, or necessary connection. And then, 200 years later, Richard Feynman still says, we have no knowledge of what energy really is. However, there are formulas for calculating some numerical quantity. So here I've put a few formulas, and like if you know any of them, then congratulations. But they won't be necessary for this talk. And like I, use a lot of these formulas in my work as a scientist. But I think for this talk, it would be unfeasible to have like a crash course of what all that kind of means. And so are we then stuck? No, I think not. We can compromise and come up with a working definition that we can use for this talk. And it goes a little bit like that, where we say energy, what we mean by that word is the capacity to change the state of a system, right? And so these are kind of examples of that definition. So in the first one here, what we do is we use energy that is stored in wood, and we use the technology of burning, to change the temperature of the room to our convenience and liking, right? And so that is the wood has energy because it has the capacity to change the state of a system. And then the second one, it's kind of similar, you could think. So we have a tractor and it uses fossil fuels. So the fossil fuels, and we use the technology of the tractor to change the state of this field. But I think it's a little bit more subtle than that, even, that we can say, look, there's an environment here, and we use the technology of the tractor to change its entire environment so that the energy flow, where in the first it was solar energy getting converted to all of life, now solar energy gets converted, or like the flow of solar energy gets appropriated for our convenience and liking, and that it only goes into food that we want to eat and not that the rest of the environment wants to eat. So we can use energy to appropriate energy flows. And then the last one, I think, is another example where we use energy, and here's the energy stored in, explosive material. And we do that to change political systems, political structures, again, to our convenience and liking, right? And so this is like the capacity to change the state of the system is a definition that really works. It's broad, but it works. It's compatible with the scientist view of energy, and it's also kind of compatible with our more conventional view of energy, in that, like, if you take a cold shower, then you really feel like you have the capacity to change the state of your life today, and so it gave you a lot of energy. So I think that's a good definition, and then, but it's quite broad. So let's try to get to contextualize this a little bit and get a little bit more concrete. In that, in science, we can measure it. And so we have like a yardstick, so to say, and we measure the units, it's like joules. So heat, work, and energy can be expressed in joules. And then there's a second unit that we have, and it's called power, and it's basically just joules per time per second, right? And so as an analogy, you could say we can measure distances, and then that's measured in meters, and then we can measure velocity, and that's meters per second or kilometers per hour, something like that. And it's quite exactly the same, like energy is measured in joule, and then power is basically energy per time. And so as one example, we could use a human, and a human roughly uses 100 watts. That means 100 joules per second. And then interestingly, 20% of that 20 watts is used only in the brain, which 2% of the body weight is only the brain, but 20% is the energy usage, which is, lies like an underlying message here that like it's really important when you measure something to use the right measuring stick. And so often I think problems arise when you use the wrong measuring stick. So for example, we could measure distance or distances in kilometers, or we could also measure it in like how much the petrol costs for a car, you know, so to do that distance. And then we would get a number as well, but it would be very much dependent on like the local fuel price. And similarly, like energy units can be expressed in dollars, but then also it's dependent on different things. So using the right units is really important. So the idea of this gigantic slide was a little bit to give you an idea of this measuring stick, like how big is a meter, how much is a joule. But I think we're already a little bit over time, so I'm going to split this, make this a little bit shorter, and I think you can look at this later again and look at the individual examples that I have. But one thing I want to pick out here is that humans are really, really bad at understanding exponential scales. So what we have here is like we have kilojoules and then megajoules and gigajoules. And we know this from like kilograms or megabytes and gigabytes. And so it seems linear to us, like it seems like there's a linear progression, but it's really not. It's an exponential scale, because what's going linear here is the exponent, right? And so to give you an example of this, if it were like seconds instead of joule, then a kilosecond would already be 16 minutes, whilst a megasecond would already be 11 days. A gigasecond would already be 31 years. So you see, this is not a linear progression, right? It gets, you know, we even skipped hours. And then after a gigasecond, 31 years, we don't even have a larger measurement unit of time that I could put here. So a terasecond would be 31,000 years. A petasecond would be 31 million years. An exasecond, 31 billion years, right? And then when we are at zeta, you know, like we have like the time equivalent of 7 times the age of the universe. So when we talk about 500 exajoules of world primary energy consumption, it is a really, really large number. And like we have a very bad implicit understanding of what that means. And that sometimes leads us to underestimate problems. But okay, one thing that is apparent from looking at more of these examples, but I'm going to go into more detail, is the energy density of oil. And so it's 1 liter of diesel, for example, has 31 megajoules of energy. And so how can we understand that? We could understand that if an average, healthy, well-fed, motivated laborer would, with an 8-hour work shift, you know, he can put out 75 watts of power. And that means, you know, an average, like a healthy worker can do 75 joules per second. So how long would he have to work to get to the equivalent of 1 liter of diesel? Well, it's 500,000 seconds. That's about 140 hours. That's about 17 work days, right? So it's a lot of time that a normal person has to work to get to the energy equivalent of just 1 liter of diesel. If you would think that, like in Europe, the average wage is 30 euros per hour. I mean, like in Bulgaria, it's only 5 euros, and in Denmark, it's 40 euros. Then you arrive at somewhere between 1,000 and 6,000 euros for the labor cost that is equivalent to 1 liter of diesel. Okay, you can apply a conversion factor because like diesel itself doesn't help. You need some kind of machine which has an efficiency factor. And then with an average of $30 or 30 euros, you're still 1 liter has the work equivalent if a human would do it for of like 1,700 euros. So that's really a lot. And so, you know, we say energy prices currently are high, you know, but with a few dollars or euros, comparatively, they're really, really low. Another way of viewing at this is that a modern tractor, let's say it uses 10 liter of diesel per hour, that would mean that it uses 380 megajoules. It's just 10 times this. That's 105 kilowatts. Again, it might have an efficiency factor, but that would be the equivalent of having 560 workers, right? Try to get 560 workers onto a field instead of one tractor. You won't get the same work done. And so really, this is where prosperity in society nowadays comes from. It's because the energy contained in the fuel, we get it for free. And so let's look at a few examples of this. So agriculture, for example, we used to do this manually or with the help of some animals. And then for a while, we had a steam-driven agricultural system. But nowadays, what we do is we have this, machines that convert huge amounts of oil into work. So really what we're doing here is like it would be wrong to say the machine is doing the work, right? What the machine is doing, it helps us convert the energy stored in fossil fuels into changing the state of a system, right? And so the machine without the oil, without the energy, would not be doing anything. So it really is, the machine only allows us to convert really, really dense energy into work that is useful for us. Then, I'll go through a few more examples. We already had renewable sea transport once in a while. And that was done with wind energy, where wind would blow onto sails and you would go ahead. And so this is like the largest renewable cargo transport ship ever built. It was called the Preußen in 1902. It had 50 crew. That means it roughly is, the energy equivalent of 50 people. That's 5 kilowatts. Nowadays, this is how we do shipping, right? And so we now have a machine in there that can convert 56,000 kilowatts of energy. So it's a factor of 10,000, right? And of course, then also this contains 24,000 containers, which is the factor of 50 towards an old ship like that. And it goes 2.5 times faster. So really that is only possible because of the energy density in our fossil fuels. The machine is a converter of this energy. One more, for example, would be transport similar on land. Or for example, industry, right? This is the garment industry. And by, back in the day when we used to be sustainable, there was a person doing this. Now we have gigantic factories that use tremendous amounts of energy to do a lot more than we were able to be doing. Another example, for example, is construction. When we did renewable construction or sustainable construction, this is the view of London, right? And so this is St. Paul's Cathedral, and we built, like in London, we built one of them, and it took more than 200 years, right? Now, modern day cathedrals, like these banking buildings, for example, they typically tend to take less than 10 years to be built. And that's because now we use these kind of machines and tools and fossil energy, whilst before you used human labor and these kind of tools. And so once we understand really what a machine helps us doing, then this graph, which is our global consumption of energy, becomes less mysterious. So let's have a look at this. This is a scale. Here it's in terawatt hours, but like I've put it in joules as well. The top here, that's 570 exajoules. So this goes from 1800 to roughly now. And what you can really see, it's basically all still fossil, right? It's coal, it's oil, it's gas. Together, these make up more than 85% of our energy budget. And it goes, exponential growth until now. And then we have about 5% of nuclear and about 5% of hydropower. And then the renewables, solar, wind, and modern biofuels and stuff, like you can't really even see the extent of it. And that is because it is less than 5%, maybe like 4%. And this kind of representation even cheats a little bit, and it's bigger than it actually should be. or at least arguably. And so, yeah, it's quite interesting because in our media or in our like understanding in like every day to day, we think like we've made great advances in solar energy, but the reality globally, and also in even the nations where we think they're very progressive, like Germany, it's largely the same picture. Like out of the global total primary energy, Germany renewables are like 6%, so it's 2% more than the global case. And so what we have to understand is where this energy is used. And it's not so much that we, the end users, use a lot of it. It's like, it's a global metabolism, right? And this is kind of a metabolic map. It's a metabolic map of E. coli bacteria, but for the purposes of this talk, doesn't really matter. We have an energy system, and the energy then gets used to convert natural resources into things that we like. And every little dot here would be an intermediate product, and every dot from the next, there's a machine that converts this. And only at the very, very end, we get consumer products that we can then use to do the things we like, driving around, making telephone calls and whatever. And that is why, like in the world energy consumption by sector graph, you see half of it is really like within the metabolism of the system. And then, another 25% is really just transport of stuff. And the final, or like the residential, that's us really, it's a comparatively small part. And so this is a system that arose over the past 200 years or something like that. And what we have to note is that it is a global system. Like there's nothing really that we can touch nowadays that is possible without a global supply chain. Even if you take something, like a tomato grown in your garden, the tools you use to grow that tomato depend on this global metabolism working. And so quite interestingly, so I showed you the map, the metabolic map of E. coli, but of course you can do this for the economy as well. And this is the US economy. What we can see is it looks a bit more messy. So that's why I choose to show you the E. coli map. And so like, yeah, everything is connected in a global system. And so a way that we often measure, the economy, which is basically the size of the metabolism of the society, is in GDP, right? And so what we can see is that there's a really, really tight correlation, or like a quite tight correlation between the GDP in here, it's in trillions, in constant inflation adjusted trillions, to the energy use globally. In here, it's in exajoules. And so this is a graph, from 1965. This is the energy there, and this is the GDP there until 2020. And you can see it's really a straight line. And this makes a lot of sense because both are connected to like the number of energy converters, the number of machines we have. The energy use is proportional to the amount of machines we have, and our metabolism, the global economy, is also proportional to the machines that we have, and not so much capital and labor, like economists say. And what you can see is really it's a straight line, and there haven't been big departures from this line. The reason why I put so much emphasis on this is that globally, or like within the establishment, what really our plan for the future is to go off this line. What we want to do is we want to keep growing the economy, at least in GDP. So we want to be going up there, but energy is supposed to be going down. And we haven't really seen this happening ever before. So there is a coupling there. You can also do it like on a per country basis instead of a global basis, and you see like economies that are larger have more GDP per capita, also use more energy. So this big blob here would be the USA, this big blob here is China, and this big blob here is India, and then the others are smaller countries. This is generally like maybe Europe, and then this is the rest of the world. Now, a very interesting analogy that I want to look at is metabolic rate of animals. And what you can see is also they all fall on a line, right? If you have a small animal now, you can't measure GDP, but we measure here the body mass as a unit. It's mouse is really small and it uses not a lot of energy. Whilst an elephant, it's big and it uses a lot of energy, right? So this connection is not only true for like economies, it's throughout nature this holds, which should make us a little bit cautious if we say we can easily divert from this correlation. And so yeah, this basically is a little bit against what the economists are saying in the last 20 years or something like that, where they say it's capital and labor that is important, and what I'm saying is it's really the energy what's important. And so as a conclusion for this first talk, for this first part, I would say, like, as a recap, energy is the capacity to affect change. Fossil fuels are really energy dense, and the global energy use is overwhelmingly fossil. And there is really no economy without energy, like they're tightly linked. All right, so then this is basically the first part, and I have no view of the chat, so I'm gonna ask Annette how many questions there have been up until now.
None so far. Just that will we be able to share these slides? I've just said we'll be sharing the recording.
Yeah, I'll also put up the slides on my website at some point. It hasn't happened yet, but they'll be available.
Here's a comment from Matthew. I only hear economists and policymakers saying we should get energy from other places, not that we need to reduce usage. So we need to find new sources.
Yeah, we'll definitely be talking about that in the second half. Yeah.
And somebody else saying, Susanna, no questions, very clear and engaging, easy to follow and appreciate the visuals. So.
All right, that's we're off to a good start then.
A good start, yeah.
Yeah. So here I've put like there's a few book recommendations here, like about general energy and civilization, how this went. I really recommend Vaclav Smil's books, and he wrote a lot, but this is basically beginner's guide, so it's small and understandable, and this is like a historical overview, and it's really interesting because it goes from like prehistoric times and until now. And this is a bit more academic, I would say, in nature and society. Also, like it treats other systems than just society. And then this book here by Geoffrey West, that's where the scaling with the animals graph came from. And I think it's a really interesting read of like, how different organisms like cities and companies and how this all fits together. All right, so it's basically what I'm saying is I didn't come up with this, other people did that. All right, so let's go right ahead. I think we're more or less on time even. The second part, and it's like I said, this is a qualitative view. What we're going to be talking about is complexity of society, energy return on investment, a little bit of growth as well. That's one topic. And the second one is like the law of diminishing returns and why those in conjunction lead to collapse of complex systems. So let's start with complexity. Oh, do we? Yeah, we do. Start with complexity. And complexity is a very interesting topic because, I mean, it applies to, from little organisms to big societies. So a lot of different people have studied this. From Wikipedia, I've got this like map of complexity sciences, and you can see lots and lots and lots of blobs. So I mean, if you would ask 100 scientists that have dealt with complexity for a definition, you would get 100 definitions. So to make it simple for this talk, I'm going to simplify and say it's just the number and type of system components, right? And so how can we understand this? For example, these are drummers in the Beijing 2008 Olympic opening ceremony. And so there's a lot of components, right? but a lot of drummers. But because they all do exactly the same thing, you wouldn't say it's, you know, that complex. And they all do the same thing. They also, you know, whilst on the other hand here, this is like a reproduction of I think a eukaryotic cell, and you see there's lots of different components, and all the components also are different types that do different things. So if, you know, you wanted to make this system of drummers more complex, you could say, okay, we introduce some violins as well, or some other instruments, and then, you know, that would be a more complex system. And then societal complexity, you know, what is it, what is it for, what does it do? And basically societal complexity, we use it to solve problems. What we do is we rearrange matter and energy flows to better suit our needs, right? And this can, like, problems, there's lots of different examples. For example, security, right? After the terrorist attacks in 9/11 in America, we see, you know, the counterintelligence and spying on people, you know, the security agencies kind of multiply. And so today America has, like, I think 18 different spy agencies that are just, you know, different agencies for spying on people locally and abroad. And so that's like a very complex system to deal with the problem of terrorism, for example. But then also, I mean, there's the whole, you know, surveillance and security and armies and stuff like that. So, you know, security, we put a lot of complex societal complexities for securing that. Similarly, you know, our agricultural systems. I have this image here of pears, pears grown in Argentina and packed in Thailand, right? So you can see it's a complex system, right? I'm not entirely sure what problem we're trying to solve here. I mean, I guess it's having food in abundance and whenever we want it, no matter what season. And actually it's even worse than this image suggests, because it's packaged in plastic, and the plastic probably is produced in China with fossil fuels that were probably extracted somewhere in the Middle East, you know. So, like, the complexity I went into this little tub, and it's probably sold in America or in Europe, right? So the amount of energy that went into making this happen, and the amount of complexity of supply chains and logistics and working parts that need to function properly to make this happen is huge. Similar healthcare, you know, our housing situation, where we live, how we live, and then naturally, you know, our governments, our, you know, bureaucracies and structures of governance, and of course that make social cohesion work. All of that is insanely complex nowadays, and solves different kinds of problems that we encountered over time. And the point that we want to delve a little bit more into now is that this, of course, requires energy, right? It needs to be done. But not just energy, any type of energy. And to understand this a little bit more, I want to introduce the concept of energy return on energy invested. So what is that? I mean, it's quite simple in the end. You have a natural resource. We don't, you know, for example, oil in the ground. And before we as a society, we can use that, we need to extract that. You know, we need to get it out of the ground, and we need to probably refine it somewhat and transport it before society can use it. And this process itself, it requires energy as well. And so then the EROI concept is just looking at the fraction between the energy that you get out for society in comparison or in relation to how much energy you need to invest for making this extraction process from resource to you know, to be usable happen. And so why is that important, and not just the energy? Why is this, you know, fraction important? And to explain this, I want to do a little thought experiment with you. And that is, let's think of a very simple agrarian society where the only energy input that it has is a farming system, right? So you would have a farmer and it produces grain. And let's say for this example now that one of these grain bushels is the energy equivalent of what one person needs to eat. if the energy return on investment would be 1, that would mean that, the energy to produce this is exactly the same as the one you get out. That means one farmer's energy input worth produces one, output, or like one person's output worth, right? So that would be an energy return of 1. So one farmer works and he gets enough energy to produce, or like to have one farmer work. What that would, or to nurture one farmer, or one person. What that would mean is that societal complexity would be very, very low, because the only thing you could have is farmers, right? Because every farmer needs to eat and everybody needs to produce the energy, and he only produces so much as he himself consumes. If now the energy return on investment would be 3, that would mean, one farmer's worth of energy input would produce 3, food outputs. And that would mean you could have 3 different people. The farmer could sustain 3 people. So now the farmer could have a wife, which, rears children, for example, or, looks after the house. And you could also have some kind of bureaucrat, organization, security person, that does everything else, and, deals with different types of problems that arise. And then, so you can see this is a more complex society than this one. This energy return of investment society of 1, this is probably not a viable society, because as soon as any problem arises where something needs to be done other than farming, there is no spare capacity to do that. Whilst, with the era of 3, you could have this person here that deals with this problem. And then, of course, if you have an energy return on investment of 10, one farmer would, produce 10 of these energy units here, these farm bushels. So he could sustain, a society that looks a lot more complex, right? So now we have, stratification of society, and we have maybe some cooks and some handymen, and a king, and maybe some separation of states and church, like a spiritual person, and some judge, and a military, and lots of different jobs and roles in society to deal with different problems. And of course, I kind of suggest here that like these more advanced or higher up strata of society are dependent on these lower ones. Like all of them are dependent on farmers, right? Because they need to eat, but then also they need the housing and the eating and whatever. But this makes us understand why energy return on investment is really what determines how much complexity a society can afford. And it's not the absolute quantity of energy that is as important. It doesn't matter if these are like 5,000 farmers here that produce 5,000 energy units here, because the energy return on investment would still be 1, and there are still all would be just farmers. And so it's not the absolute energy, like the 500 exajoules or whatever, that determine how much complexity we can afford. It's really the energy return on investment that determines complexity. And so this was like a very simplified thought experiment, a thought experiment, which is not probably realistic, but reality is comparable. And so what we see here is a graph of the UK, so United Kingdom, and it's the percentage of GDP allocated to energy expenditures. Basically, that's the farmers in the previous graph, but of course we have different types of energy inputs, and it goes from the year 1300 to the year 2000, and it's from 0 to 80%. And so what you can see here in the very beginning, where the society is really simple, a lot of the energy, like 70% of GDP, and GDP, remember, is a measure of like the metabolism, and like 80% of that is in the primary economy. That's like the energy economy. It's wood, fuel, fodder, and food, basically. And like, between 1300 and 1700 or 1650 or something like that, more than 50%, like a really large percentage, just goes for primary energy requirements. And then suddenly we see some kind of changes happening, and that's like at the advent of industrialization, where we see it goes a little bit down, right? And that's because new technologies arrive that lets us use this energy more efficiently, and that's like water mills and treadmills and stuff like that, and mechanization, and it means that like in percentage of GDP, you know, per person, it uses less, and people have more spare energy for doing other things. For example, building ships and starting colonialism, right? And so what happens over time, though, is that like what used to be driven by wood at first, and also like colonialism that uses a lot of wood, the UK starts to run out of wood. And so what they do is they say, okay, we can't burn wood anymore, let's start burning coal, right? And so they start to use a lot of coal. And at first it's very easy to get, but over time, you know, they need to be dig deeper and deeper holes to get to the coal, and they get problems with groundwater. So they invent pumps that are powered with steam. And so now suddenly they get like to steam power, and it's a huge change. And again, energy return on investment goes up, and so less percentage of the GDP has to be allocated to the primary economy, and coal goes up, and then we get the, you know, internal combustion engine invention, and now suddenly instead of coal we can use oil, which is better in every respect, right? And so energy return on investment goes up even more. And we can see like out of total GDP of the UK, it's just very, very little spent on these primary economy, and energy return on investment is much higher. And like percentage of workers that do this of the whole society is very, very low, and lots of other people can do lots of other things. And so basically this is the same as we saw in the previous graph, or the thought experiment we see happening in real in the UK. And then like these intellectual paradigm things like Malthus predictions and the second law and stuff, I think we'll touch on this a little bit later. Furthermore, okay, but so what we kind of see here happening is this spiral, and like it's normally called the energy complexity spiral, but I've written growth on here as well, and you can kind of start it wherever you want. And so it's like you have an abundance of energy at some point. Maybe it's like a technological invention. For example, very at the beginning, the technology invention is that we understand that we can cook food, you know, instead of eating it raw, and that means, you know, we can access a lot more food, you know, or like the quality of our food goes up, and we can cook meats, and it's a lot better. So we have now spare energy. And that leads to growth of society, but then a larger society needs more complexity for organizing its bureaucracy. Like first you had just a little, you know, 10 people, and now maybe we have 50. And so we need to have some kind of chieftain and whatever, you know, so something more. And so this complexity then in turn requires more energy again. And so we go start looking for better technologies and more inventions, and we create a surplus again, which creates growth again, which creates problems again, that we solve again with more complexity. And so the spiral goes up and up and up and up. And so then this immediately logically leads us to the question, like for our complex society nowadays, is there a minimum energy return on investment, like, or a minimum complexity level that we need to sustain it? And yes, there is, and I'm going to say it's roughly an energy return on investment of 10. And so why is that? Of course, you know, if it were 1, you could only extract the energy. It needs to be more than 1, so that you can actually refine the energy. It needs to be even more than that you can actually transport it. It needs to be more than that again, so you can actually not just have energy, but grow food. And so, of course, you know, to support families and education and healthcare and arts and all the nice things we do, the energy return on investment needs to be higher, right? And so why do I say it needs to be 10? Well, this is easily explainable in this graph. And so what this is like the net energy availability in comparison to energy return on investment. And what that is basically just, if you have an energy return on investment of 10, that means it's for every 10 units that you get of energy, you need to invest 1 into generating those. So net for society, you only have 9, right? So that's 90%. Whilst if your energy return on investment would be 20, let's say, then like for every 10 units, you need to reinvest half again, so you get like 95%. And so this is really the formula for this is quite simple. It's 1 minus 1 over energy return on investment. So but what we can see, it's not a linear decrease, right? And so when you get to low energy return on investments and it really starts falling down the cliff here, and that's why it's called the net energy cliff. For like an energy return of 1 or 2, it means, like you need to reinvest a lot of the energy back into generating the energy. And so energy flows, then are not as useful anymore. And that kind of explains to us why we say, there is, that's one too many. There's this lower limit here where below this, when we get into energy return investments of like below 10, we probably won't be able to keep the complexity that we have in society nowadays. And it also explains why, when you're somewhere around here, changes don't really matter so much. And so now I've talked a lot about energy return on investment as a concept, but let's look now a little bit where actually technologies that we have lie on this grass. Oh, well, it kind of doesn't want to do how I wanted. Here, so historically for oil and gas, it was probably a lot larger than 50. We're thinking somewhere around 100 at least. Nowadays, though, global oil and gas is probably somewhere, in this range here. Coal is the technology that has the highest energy return on investments that we currently have available. And it's maybe like for China, it's a bit low, and then for other countries might be even a bit higher, but it's somewhere in this range here. And so for wind, we say it's, in the literature, at least it's around 20, but I think this is the best case scenario, and I wouldn't put like a blob. It depends a lot on your exact conditions, but let's, just for giving us a rough idea, let's say it's 20. That's without storage of the energy for like intermittency issues. And with solar as well, similar, I would say maybe best case it's that it's 10, right? Now, of course, I could put other technologies. I didn't bother, like biofuels, for example, that's somewhere a little bit above 1, between 1 and 3, like it's really not very efficient in terms of energy return on investment. An interesting one would be nuclear, and then the proponents of nuclear say it's roughly 15. But if you really looked into accounting and you take into account that you need to mine uranium and refine uranium and transport uranium, that kind of stuff, and when you start including all these extra costs, it's maybe around 5. And I mean, there's other technologies, but I don't want us to fetishize too much on the actual numbers, because firstly, I think it really gets political and it gets really difficult on what are the exact boundaries, what do you want to compare, what system you're looking at to get at exact numbers. And I don't think that the exact numbers are really that important, because what we saw already with this example of historic global oil and gas and global oil and gas now is that there's a trend. And this trend is that they all move this direction towards this red zone here over time. And so I'm going to show another slide with a few of these energy return on investment trends. So this top one here, that would be Norwegian oil. And so you can see it goes up at first, but then it continues, going downhill at some point. Quite linearly, but it at the very start it goes up a bit, but then it continues going down. And then this here is oil and gas in the UK, and I would think that it would be similar values, but you see it's very different values here. But I think this is system boundaries, but the trend is the same, right? It goes up a little bit and then it continues to go down. Here, that would be an example for global energy return on investment of oil. And this is a very different method of calculating it. And so it looks a lot different, but we can see as well that until the 40s, it kind of maybe goes up and then it just keeps going down. And so how can we understand this? Why is that? Because it's really not the direction we want it to be going, right? We don't want to fall down that energy cliff that where the complexity just goes. And to understand this, I forgot this one. It's a paper, a very recent paper from last year, and it says societal energy return on investment of all of society is probably somewhere around 8.5, right? And that's below that 10 thing that I said before. And so why is that? How can we understand this? And that's where we now start talking about the law of diminishing returns. And so the law of diminishing returns, really, it's very simple to explain. Imagine an apple tree, right? And we want to have apples. And so at first, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit that is very easy to pick. But then over time, it gets harder to pick because you pick away the easy apples. And now to get to apples, you need to climb, and climbing costs more energy. Or you need to build a ladder and walk up the ladder, and that costs more energy. And so because you always, of course, start with the easy ones, that kind of explains why over time it gets harder and harder and harder. And then energy return on investments over time get lower, lower, and lower. And this doesn't only apply, I'm going to skip this one. This doesn't only apply to energy supplies. It applies to anything where the depletion rate exceeds its regeneration rate. And for a lot of things, regeneration rate is very, very low. It's in like timescales of millions of years or something like that. And our depletion rates are, in years or centuries maybe. So it's energy supply, but it's also resources and fertile soil and science and technology. And these are a little bit more like complexity itself. I'm maybe not going to go into all of them, seeing that we have quite a bit of, I'm not as fast as I was hoping. But let's look again at energy. Like at the start of the oil age, you just had to drill a little hole in the ground somewhere in Pennsylvania, and oil came gushing out ready to use, right? And nowadays it's like an offshore drilling platform that's like technologically the most advanced thing we've ever done, and it's really not as easy. And so on a graph perspective, you can see the same thing happening. So if you look at this graph here, it's in the blue and red is the extraction rate of global conventional oil, and the red is the discovery rate. And you can see we extract more than we keep discovering. So that's not a good situation to be in. And then also the development expenses in billions. That's the right scale here. It goes up and up and up. And interestingly, there's really a step change in 2005, which kind of explains why 2009, then we start to have a financial crisis and that kind of stuff. So, but yeah, we can see that in for energy, and this is like conventional oil, but it's true for all other types of oil and gas and fossil resources as well. And so mining, and that's quite relevant for our ideas of switching to different energy technologies and everything, electrifying everything. It's dependent on a lot of resources like rare earth metals and copper and that kind of stuff. And so this is an example how copper production looked, maybe 100 years ago, and it was like manual with like horse-drawn carts and that kind of stuff. And nowadays, this is a copper mine. And you can see these little trucks here. I don't know if you've seen a picture of those before in big. They're humongous, right? They're the size of houses. And so this is not only larger because we use more copper nowadays than we did back then. It's because the ore grade is going down. And what that means is that then per unit of copper that you want to have, you need to process a lot of more other material, right? And that just requires then a lot more energy to be transporting all that other material. Similarly, you need to be milling your raw ore into smaller particle sizes to get at the copper, and that uses exponentially more energy. And so then what you can see, this is copper production in Chile, which is one of the largest copper producers, is that in respect to the year 2001, the energy consumption goes up and up and up and up, and then the production levels, and they're a little bit higher, but they're more linear, right? And the energy consumption goes steadily up. It's not only this law of diminishing return also applies to more like esoterical things for like science and technology, where also the easy inventions have been made, and so here this is an example where it's Marie Curie in her laboratory in the center of Paris. And if you think about her and her husband and her 2 children, that's 5 people, and they worked in laboratories like that, and they were able to get like 5 Nobel Prizes. Nowadays, science looks more like this. This is a picture into CERN, and you can see tiny people there and huge apparatuses, and I don't think they've gotten a Nobel Prize yet. And so it gets a lot harder to make new inventions nowadays, and we need to work a lot more. And then, of course, this is a picture of the Large Hadron Collider, which we just saw, and it's at 27 kilometers in diameter. And then this is what we propose to be doing in the future, and it gets ever more difficult and uses more energy to get to new scientific breakthroughs. And then this is the same idea in the form of a graph, where you see declining productivity of innovation measured by patents per inventor. You see the patents per inventors from like the 70s to the 2000s, which just kind of goes down. And the average size of patenting teams, it keeps going up. And then there is something that you can think of for complexity itself as well. It's a little bit heady to get into, and I don't want to explain everything here. It's basically when you have a simple system and you introduce some complexity, it gives you a lot of benefits. It's, for example, when you have a group of people and you introduce like some kind of government structure. And that really that makes you, it gives you a lot of, the complexity gives you a lot of benefits. But then adding additional complexity, it still gives you benefits until a certain point, but not as much anymore as the initial addition of complexity. And then actually, if you keep increasing complexity, you get less returns as well. And that, for example, you could think like, if you keep adding, agencies to your government, the first few ones, you have like a business agency and an agricultural agency and a health department or something like that, and they're useful and they're helpful. But by the time you add the 20th, department, you have to coordinate between all of those 20, and there's a lot of extra work and not as much extra benefit. And like mathematicians look at this a lot, because they can like have abstract values for complexity, but also this is kind of chemists do similar stock flow models, and all they get kind of these curves where complexity keeps going up and then kind of dropping off quite rapidly. And so we can see that happen with abstract concepts like complexity as well. And so then why does this, why is that a problem, right? And so why does it need to collapse? And it's very simple. We have these two trends that necessarily need to happen over time. And the one trend was the first one, where like due to the law of diminishing returns, the energy return on investment over time goes down. Whilst on the other hand, the necessary complexity of your system just to keep it running keeps going up, right? Because you keep growing and there keeps coming up new problems, and even just maintenance gets more difficult over time. And you first need to do maintenance, then you need to do maintenance of your maintenance system, then you need to do maintenance of the maintenance system, and so on. Like it, over time, systems need more complexity. And so these are the trends that oppose each other. And then at some point, there's just a point where, you don't have enough energy return on investment anymore to keep up the complexity that you need, even if you don't grow, if you just stay stationary, to keep up the system, to keep up the necessary complexity. And that's the point where you start degrading and where collapse happens. And that's true for basically all complex systems and all life. All life is complex systems. And that's why there is no immortals. There's only in sci-fi or in fantasy, there's immortals, right? Real people. At some point, we get degradation of our life support systems. We get infections, and our guts don't work so well anymore, and we don't eat as much, and we don't move as much, and our joints start hurting, and we also don't eat as well anymore. And at some point, we can't keep up the complexity of our systems anymore, and then we start degrading and dying. And it's the same thing that happens for societies, and that's why they collapse as well, and all kind of organisms. So there it is, really, like why there's no eternal life. So that might be a bit frustrating, and so like we always try to come up with solutions, right? And I want to go into two things that like we try to do within our paradigm often, which seem like solutions but really aren't solutions. And the one is like more energy, just like more, why doesn't that work? And then the second thing is we think about it like efficiency and technology and progress. And there's people that say, oh, we can always invent our way out of these crises, and it always go up and up and up. And so I'm going to only talk, I think, about renewable energy and not so much about fission and fusion, because I think the logic is the same. So renewable energy, I mean, we've seen this in the first part, right? It's quantitatively still irrelevant. And then also its growth potential is limited. And that comes because the growth of an energy system is dependent on its energy return on investment, right? If we think again of our agrarian thought experiment, if the farmer produces 3 energy outputs, then in the next generation or the next cycle, there can be, then 3 farmers, and then 9, and then, multiple of that, 3 times 9, 27. And so whilst when, the energy return on investment would be 10, then in the second generation, there can already be 10 farmers, and then there can be 100 farmers, right? And so the growth of the system is dependent on the energy return on investment. But you can never have the whole energy that you produce going to reproduction or like to growth of the system, because you have other tasks as well. But like that's in general the maximum. And then because the energy return on investment of solar is low, or like renewable is quite low, its growth can't be high. Of course, you could use fossil to grow our solar system, but I mean, that would be a bit beside the point, but then still it can only be as fast as the fossil system grew, because then use that energy return on investment. And that system took 100 years to become as big as it is now. So you can't be as fast as that. And so like its potential of growing to quantitatively relevant sizes is just not there. But also then qualitatively, I think renewable energy is irrelevant for our type of society, because the energy return on investment is too low to sustain current complexity. And I'm going to, did this happen? No, what happened here? Show a graph. So I said photovoltaics, right? I said the energy return on investment is 10, but it's really only 10 in like a best case scenario where you have lots of irradiance and lots of like sun per square meter. And then you get like energy return on investments of like 10 or 12 or something like that. But for most of the world already it's lower. And like for UK, it's only 4, and Finland, it's only 2. And that's only if you have a very tight boundary definition of what energy return on investment means. But it means like only, producing the solar panels. But then if you start including other things, like also getting the energy not from the panel but to the consumer, if you include that in your energy return on investment calculation, it's a lot lower again already, right? And then you have, for the world, photovoltaics only of 3. And then if you include even more, like not only the energy to get your photovoltaic energy to the consumer, but also producing that transportation system and all the, cables and wires and structures that we need to make that happen, then, photovoltaics, the energy return investment is really, really low. That is fine. You can make a system like that. It's just you can't make a highly, highly complex globalized system like ours based on that kind of energy system, based on that EROI. This is a similar graph as well, just on this kind of on this curve we've seen before, and it's for like all renewable energy technologies, or like most of them, like large hydro, wind onshore, wind offshore, PV and CSP. And like if we start here, then we see hydro is really good, and then there's the wind, and then there's the solar. But as we keep like taking more things into account, and we need to take more things into account, the larger the percentage of solar gets, right? Nowadays, we wouldn't have to take all these extra things into account, because our energy system is produced by fossil fuels. We use fossil fuels to mine the copper to make our transmission cables. But the more percentage of renewable energy we want, the more we will need to use renewable energy to do this maintenance stuff. And so then like these things become relevant, and we can kind of just seize that then like energy return on investment is really low for solar or like renewable sustainable energy technologies. And that is why when we lived sustainably, hundreds of years ago, societal complexity was lower, or wealth, or like physical wealth was less, right? It's very clear. Then there's another thing, and it's again a case of the law of diminishing returns on investment, where the first solar plants and the first windmills, we put them at the best locations for solar and wind, right? But then we can't keep putting it at the best locations. At some point, the best locations are already taken by other solar and wind. And then we need to put them at less optimal positions. But that means that the energy return on investment goes down. And this is kind of a thing from a paper that shows that if we want renewable energy with very, very high energy return on investment for Europe, basically the only thing you can do is offshore wind around the UK and then the Baltics and the North Sea shore there. If it can be a little bit lower, like 9, you can do some onshore wind as well. If it can be lower again, only 6, then you can start to do wind onshore in lots of different places, and we can start to do a little bit of solar and CSP in Spain or like southern European countries. And only if we're willing to accept really, really low energy return on investments of only like 4, we can, we get a lot of options for renewable technologies. That's again, and that's why also if you keep expanding renewable energies, the average energy return on investment of renewable energy goes down as well, which is maybe not something you think about at the first moment, because you think the sun always continues shining, right? But the more we expand the system, the less good our locations get. And I think the argument for fusion and fission and that kind of stuff is similar. Like the energy return on investment is very low, and that's okay if you want to have a simple agrarian society, but that's not the situation we're living in, right? And then the second thing I want to, that we've talked about. The second thing I want to talk about is the efficiency idea, right? We're just going to keep getting more efficient and more efficient and more efficiency, and like we always have new technology. And the first thing to talk about then is the Jevons paradox. And I want to illustrate that by thinking about, let's imagine you have a heating system in your house and it's very inefficient, right? So you put a lot of your income into heating your house in the winter. And then time goes by and there's more efficient heating, and you exchange that old like oil burner inefficient thing to something very new and very efficient. What then happens is you pay less for heating your house and you have more energy, more money available. And what you do is you then not just spend money on heating, you start buying a TV and you start buying a car and you start buying other kind of consumer products, and all of these cost money and then use energy. And because it's now a diversified economy that not only needs to produce heaters, needs to produce TVs and phones and cars and all kind of stuff, it actually adds on, and you use more energy that than you've actually saved by your more efficient heating. And that's called the Jevons paradox, after a scientist in the 18th century that saw this happening already in the age of coal, basically. And so that also explains why, although efficiency over the past 100 years or so has been increasing all the time. If, for example, look at the Haber-Bosch process, which is really, really important for the food we produce. It's over like from 1910 to 2000, it's been getting better and better and better and better in like how much energy it needs for producing ammonia. And yet we're still producing more and more and more, right? Similarly, for example, aluminium production. It gets better, better, and better, but we still use more, and we just use then more and more and more. And so there is no absolute decoupling we think we should be happening. But also, there is a theoretical minimum. Like laws of thermodynamics just kind of dictate that for certain conversions, you need to put in a certain amount of energy, and you can get close to that, and you can get maybe ever close, but you can never get to like these thermodynamical limits. Like no matter how much investment we put into technology, these limits we will not reach. And so there's a limit to which like technology can help us. And like a lot of it we've already done for the more important processes. And then this is true for all the conversions that we do, but it's also true for our energy production systems. And like there is just very, very stringent physical limits. And for example, for internal combustion or like heat engines, it's called the Carnot limit, and it's very defined. And for photovoltaic cells, it's the Shockley-Kaiser limit, and it's very defined. Like you cannot get a single junction photovoltaic cell that is more than 40% efficient. For windmills, it's the Beetz limit, and it's just like there is strong limits dictated by the laws of physics that we cannot think that we can overcome. And so, yeah, what we always then say is, oh, if something gets too difficult, we can just replace it by something else. Like if there's no copper anymore, we'd use something else. But like elements in the periodic system are not infinitely replaceable. Of course, for some problems, for example, when we looked at FCCs in English, like the things that produce the ozone hole, we could find just different molecules that did the same job. But for a lot of the things that are really important for society, for example, copper for electricity transmission, there is nothing that conducts as well as copper that is remotely as available, right? If you go for aluminium, it just conduces a lot less good than copper. So there's a non-fungibility, like a non-exchangeability of things. And then also, like these are efficiency changes basically how like your mileage of the car, you would say, but it doesn't change the size of the tank. And so like the energy return on investment is not changed by the efficiency of what you do with that energy. And so at best, it can delay the energy return on investment problem, but it doesn't solve it. And then there's also a complexity issue, right? If you use these very, very complex technologies, you need a higher EROI and not a lower one. And this I'm going to skip. So these are like very, yeah, I'm going to skip that as well. Like in detailed criticisms of this, like ideas in modernity, let's say, of like progress and technology everlasting. And we always claim ourselves in science to be very rational. But the reality is, and this is not new, this has been picked up by people, for the last 100 years, that the thing we do with this energy is not so rational. I mean, this is kind of my trying to explain this. And it's like the system we've built, it takes natural resources and cheap capital, cheap labor, right? And what it produces is consumer junk, emissions, and environmental destruction. This is the machine that we're building, right? To chase some kind of number, GDP, whatever that measures, and have it go higher and higher and higher. And then the question is, do we really want to produce more energy in that system? Is that really the problem we're facing? And then you can see, like, these are like things I know little about, but maybe because I'm from Frankfurt, this is like a German school, Max Weber and Max Horkheimer. They criticize this like pseudo-rational thinking, right? And then with, postmodern thought like Foucault and Derrida and stuff, people like those, they criticize as well. Or like, I mean, it isn't as rational as we think. And like Albert Einstein says, you can't solve a problem with the ways of thinking that created the problem. It's not entirely on here, but so I don't think it really more energy or more efficiency is hitting the problem, like the problems that we have. okay, but then if we don't have any solutions, and what I've said is that like already we have like a societal era of only 8, and we need 10. I mean, the question we kind of have to put ourselves is like, why hasn't it collapsed already, right? I think there is a very concrete explanation for this. And if you look at energy again, you know, after 2000, what happened is we don't know this as much because it's not reported so much. After 2000, we have a huge increase in coal, and that happens mainly in China and India. You can see the energy consumption of China by source, and you can see, you know, after 2000 and really 2005, and that's when oil, conventional oil at least, gets to have a lot of problems. That rises quite quickly in comparison to what it did before. And so this, you know, re-emergence of coal that we've kind of left behind initially, in combination with the advent of, or like the US shale revolution, it's called, that's what, you know, enabled us to keep energy return on investment levels societally high enough, I think, for the past, you know, 10 years or so. But then the question is, of course, how long can that last? How, you know, this kind of trick we've done here. I think also there is just a way we can cheat, or like is by using debt, and that's like a short-term fix, I would say. And then also there's just kind of a latency, right? You know, when you start ignoring the little engine light in your car, you know, that yellow light, you don't break down immediately. You just kind of stop going to the maintenance, and over time that will cause your car to break down, but it's not something that happens immediately. And similarly, I think currently what we're doing is a lot of our infrastructure maintenance that we should be doing, we're not doing. And so like slowly our streets degrade and our bridges degrade and start collapsing here and there. And we still repair them, but we don't repair them as much as we did or we need to keep the system working of 100%. And then also we have to admit that there is already signs of collapse, right? So for example, a sign of collapse is pandemics. Why is that, you ask? Well, I mean, when, and we see this in lots of previous collapses of previous societies, when, you know, the energy return on investment isn't high enough anymore, nutritional quality goes down. So people aren't as healthy as they were before. And at the same time, other problems arise, and like the healthcare system doesn't work as well anymore, and so you get more vulnerable for pandemics to take root. And that's kind of a thing that happened, I think, as well with the pandemic we've faced just now. Other signs of collapse are like economic problems, right? And that's very easily explainable, of course, because when the energy return investment goes down, what happens is that the complexity we can hold isn't as high anymore, and the size of the metabolism needs to shrink, and that just kind of then relates or translates into economic problems like inflation, unemployment, high inequality, and all these other things like shortages of fuel and food. They are, you know, a sign that our energy return on investment isn't as high as we would have to have it. Similar, for example, rise of populism, polarization, migration. So what happens is that we don't feel the effects like similar all of us, and the people that get squeezed the soonest are the ones that are like not in power, so like poor people, you know, or people that are not as economically fortunate, let's say. And so what happens is they get unhappy, and so then they start, you know, voting more extremely, and that's how populism then rises. But we always have lots of explanations for this, but we don't think immediately that it's an energy problem. But in the end, it is caused by energy issues, because if we had enough energy, we just could make everybody happy and we could fulfill all the dreams that we promise. But yeah, we can't, and that's what's then happening. And then I think like all the wars that we see in the previous, you know, 40 years or something like that, at least have a resource component, but like most of them are resource wars, right, to get to the resources that we need to keep the system running. Okay, so this is basically the second part, and we're a bit late, but the conclusions are what.
Sven, I wonder if we just need to take the temperature of the room.
Yes.
Just to say, some people have had to leave.
Yeah.
And are looking forward to the recording. I wonder what people would like. Would they like you to continue? Just let it take the time it takes, or
Yeah.
I just feel we need to just check in with people.
Yeah, of course.
I know you've got something really important to say still.
Yeah.
Anybody want to make anybody? There's a question. How long do we need? Somebody else has to log off.
Yeah, I think. I mean, yeah.
Needs to leave at 5 to 6.
5 to 6. I mean, okay.
Are you happy to continue? And if people need to go, they need to go, but then at least the recording will be there.
Yeah, of course. I'm happy with that. And I think what we did until now is building a lot. And then I think now we can come to some conclusions, and I can make it a bit quicker than.
Somebody's asking, is there going to be time for questions?
There is going to be time for questions. I think that would be really valuable.
Hang in, guys.
Yeah.
We'll try and do that.
Yeah. Okay.
Conclusions.
So partly it's really a few predictions based on energetics, and talking about death and hope a little bit, and stages of grief, and why we should bother with energetics and how that helps us deal with our emotions. And so we can think this kind of, like we somehow got through history, and we described that a lot to where we're now. And then there's still lots of different futures that are possible. But I think energetics can kind of constrain this, and that we can say the type of society that is still possible is much simpler than ours. Like in public discourse, we often think, or we say, like, either we change or we don't change. And if we don't change, then like there'll be some bad climate change options. But the reality is, like, that's not an option. The complexity of our society is not possible to hold. Their collapse does happen whether we want it or not. So what's probably still possible is simple societies, or there could be life but no humans. I think there's a possibility there's no life on Earth, but I don't think it's very high. But then the pathways are also very unclear. I can't give you really good explanations of what leads to this and what leads to that. I think like energetics really can't say a lot about that. So how can we understand collapse? I think we can go through this very quickly. I think there's like social hierarchies collapse, centralization of power collapses, occupational specialization doesn't work anymore, information and trade flows ceases, and all these things that we do with complexity, they just kind of stop. This would be another way of understanding this, but I think I'm going to go through it a bit quicker now. So an analogy that we could use is that of how humans die. And if we look at that, satisfaction is just like a random indicator. But over the age of like old people, this is like a random selection of a few hundred people. It kind of goes down, but you can't really tell much from that, right? But if you sort it differently, if you sort it like time to death, there's a trend that emerges, and that it's kind of goes slowly at first, and then there's like some kind of transition happening, and then goes really, really quickly. And this is called the terminal decline in humans. And I think we can understand this in that, like, the repair mechanisms, or like the available complexity at first to problems still enough, and like you can deal with whatever's happening, but at some point you can't anymore, and then things go down very, very quickly. And I think we can understand collapse of our society a little bit similar, that at first, how do you go back? Two ways: gradually first, and then very, very suddenly. I think there's something to be learned from previous collapses, but like we have to realize that our society is fundamentally different than everything that came before. It's a global system, and it's a fossil system, and nothing has been like that before. And so we always think that like we here in the center of global capitalism are maybe safe, and the periphery will collapse before. I think that's a dangerous assumption. And so a few things that we can, I think, say right away. Will AI take over? Probably not. Will fascists, Facebook, China, surveillance state take over? Briefly at best. More likely is like neo-feudalism as long as agriculture works. Will we achieve our Paris goals? No, we won't. Will we achieve geoengineering? No, probably not. Nuclear war, I think, now becomes a possibility again because, well, let's not go into it. Will humanity survive? I think it's possible. There's nothing that energetics say is impossible for humans to survive. Will nature survive? Highly likely, I think. Will we survive? Will you survive? Will I survive? No, we will die. But that's no news. We were going to die anyways. So we have to see that there's going to be dramatic changes for us in our next like 20, 30 years. And we have to wonder how much of our food system we can uphold, how much of our cities we can uphold, all these kind of things. And really, we've been living for 200 years in a fossil, or like, not, but like, let's say 70 years in a fossil system, right? And this has created or like molded our worldviews and narratives and all like how we conceptualize of reality. And I think all of that is probably not going to stay. And so what is my suggestion, what we should be doing? It's very, very simple, I think, and it's a bit dramatic, and it's prepare to die. Okay, what do I mean by that? I mean actual, real, physical death. I think it's going to come for us sooner than we expect. Can I put a timeline on this? Maybe, like, not really strongly. I think maybe, from the energy perspective, it's going to be years, decades, maybe like 10 years, 20 years or something like that, but not more, right? And so I'm not saying die. I think I'm saying, like, let's prepare. Let's look at what death means. And like, if we, let's say we have 10 years to live, what are we going to do with that time, right? And so preparing for death kind of typically means letting go of things, like your hopes and dreams of salvation, or like your progress narratives, or maybe even your material wealth. Why do I say this? And it's not like there's no like cheeky dualism here, where I think if you do that, then that's going to lead to good outcomes. I'm just saying that because if you want to have any chance of integrating this knowledge in this talk, I think that is the work that we need to do without going insane. And I think it's just intrinsically true, and that's why I think it's valuable for us. I think it's intrinsically true that we have less time. Sure, I think if we start facing death, I think it'll be good for us, but I think it'll just I'm not suggesting that this will lead to like our salvation. We have to just see that carrying capacity of the planet just will dramatically decrease, and so we won't have 7 billion continuing in the 21st century. And that just kind of means that we have to look at how we want to deal with that. And so then that's basically it. Thanks you for your attention. Make of it what you will. And I have 5 more slides on deep adaptation and energetics and Kubler-Ross and that kind of stuff. Maybe want to take the temperature again. Do you want to go through these 5 more slides?
There's a thumbs up. I know Terry was suggesting we perhaps needed to finish, but perhaps just very quickly.
Okay, so really what is I think, and this is happening in deep adaptation anyways, we realize somehow that we've got bad news, and that kind of puts us in a crisis mode. And then, there's these stages of grief that I think we're going through. And we in deep adaptation think about like that a lot, but I think it's happening to all of us. And so the first thing you can do is, of course, denial, right? And I think 95% of people will just do denial. And I think that's okay. And it's very understandable. We're standing here basically and we say, like, the prophets of doom, like the end is nigh. and there's plenty of things to suggest, like there's explanations for that. These people have been around all the time, and we could say we're still here, I have more important business to attend. I think the problem is here is a bit of survivor's bias, right? And also like there's a difference that there might have been religious people in the past, but now it's really the scientists that are saying that. And so what I think, this understanding of energetics does is kind of, it helps us a little bit more to get out of this denial, but also a little bit to understand that in a way, this had to happen. Like as soon as fossil fuels were in the world, some organism was going to find them and exploit them. And that is just very, very understandable from a physics point of view. And there was not, it's a pity that we're experiencing this time maybe, but it wasn't really avoidable, I would say. And then anger, I think as well, again, like I think it's already present in a lot of people because collapse is already happening, and then not everybody understands the energetic reasons for that, and so we direct it maybe in the wrong directions. And so, for example, currently, we blame Russia a lot for the war, right? But then, or the Ukraine war, we blame that for high energy prices. But if you look at it in detail, you actually see that the energy prices rise ahead of the Russian war or the Ukrainian war. Similarly, we blame COVID for our problems with the economy. And then if you look at it in detail, you see the economy was in deep danger before the COVID crisis hit, the pandemic crisis hit. And so understanding energetics really helps us in like directing our anger, maybe away from self or others, or like intergenerational angers or international anger, and understand a little bit better that it's systems or narratives that don't serve us well anymore. And then as well, I think like it might be actually good to understand our anger a lot, because it might actually be helpful in the future in enforcement of like our values and our boundaries and that kind of stuff. And then I think this knowledge is also important for understanding like bargaining. And I think a lot of the things that happen, like green growth, and sustainable development, is really bargaining. We kind of want to keep our lifestyle going and not pay for the costs, right? And like, it's absolutely ridiculous, like green growth forever, growth forever. The only thing that grows forever is cancer, and that like kills everything that it touches. But then more subtly, maybe like also in intentional communities and regenerative agriculture, these things we do, I'm not saying don't do it, but like if you think we're going to cheat death by that, you probably, setting yourself up for being disappointed. Because, if there is millions of hungry people roaming around, are you really certain that you can keep up your, happy little commune and not get overrun by, angry and desperate people? It's going to be difficult. You have to be very, very remote for that to work. And then depression and hopelessness, and like I think there's a lot of paradoxical stuff with that, or with reality now, where I was past year sitting at home doing not a lot, being depressed and anxious, and I realized for this kind of problematic, actually that was the best I could be doing, because if I would have been productive and I would have been striving, I would have been producing more, consuming more, and doing more, and wouldn't have been better, right? Maybe. And then like I think this, always being hopeful, it's not necessarily a good idea sometimes, I think, because if we keep like in capitalism, we have this future orientation of like, it will always get better in the future. And we have like, we feel we have a personal stake in this. And if you keep hope of that upright, we lose this like hypothetical personal benefit in the future. We fear that we'll lose that. And so we're preventing change in a way by like keeping our hope alive. And so maybe like, really salvation is in hopelessness and not in hope. And so I think as well, like, saying to people you will die, or like prepare for die, seems like very, very well, radical maybe, and problematic, but really it might be a message that is positive, because it leads us to value our life more, and gives us purpose of meaning, not despite being hopeless that we'll survive, you know, but just because of it, because we now know we're going to die, and we can more rationally make decisions of how we want to spend our time, and maybe spend it wisely and better and more meaningfully. Yeah, I guess that's all. I'll put these slides up on my homepage, which is fenergy.info, and hope that we can discuss this a bit more. All right, that's that.
Thank you, Sven. There's so much there. I know we're out of time, but there might be people who want to spend a little more time giving thoughts or asking questions. Can we just take 30 seconds to take a big breath, maybe stretch, to just kind of maybe just check in with how you're feeling about all this, or where your attention has been drawn, where your curiosity is, where your body lands with it. Just 30 seconds checking inside, and then we'll give a few minutes and whatever time you have to your questions. So maybe the length of sort of 5 breaths, just to stay quiet. Okay, you've been patient and engaged for a long time, but what's on your mind, and is there anything anybody wants to respond with or ask? Just unmute yourself and go for it. Virginia.
Then I just want to say, and Annette, thank you so much. An incredibly, for me, particularly powerful was the last bit, your sort of conclusions, as it were, and the hard-hitting directness that you've presented us with. I'm incredibly grateful for. So I thank you so much to think about, and I agree about the hopelessness and the fact that living the best life we can in the face of hopelessness is where we need to go. So thank you so much. I'm looking forward to hear. I'm going to look at it all again in the recording, because not so much the graphs and things which make my head go fuzzy, but the overall, the whole thing, and how you've pitched it, and your reasoning, not just yours, of course, the state of degradation, so helpful. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Virginia.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Michael.
Sven, thank you for all this effort and the years of work you've put into these thoughts. I broadly agree with everything that you've said, but coming from more of an economics and a science background, I wonder, in the back of my mind, some of these things, that it's very quantitative by necessity, but I wonder if perhaps the qualitative nature of things changes the quantitative outcome. And by that, I think I give you an example of the farmers, where you're saying one farmer is, I'm thinking that maybe a society where there's one farmer supporting 5 guys making flat screen TVs is quite a different society qualitatively than one farmer supporting one guy that makes flat screen TVs and 3 that are musicians. And so the paradigm shift there is a dematerialization of the society, which, even though the rules apply, mean that the needs of the society are a lot lighter. or qualitative things like children in China, or people are having less children in China because it's too crowded. And so where do you bring qualitative in order to adjust these facts? I know these are laws of physics and other things, but it seems to me that somehow they're alterable in some profound way by us human beings. You say that?
Yeah, I think I agree. So, I mean, what I've been talking about is a lot of material wealth, right? And so material wealth is always coupled to energy because it's a material thing. But then, for us humans, maybe that is not necessarily the best predictor of happiness, right? And GDP as well. It measures something, and that's what it is GDP. But it's not really, is that good correlation or good metric for happiness? Maybe not, right? So of course there is societies we can envision, and for example, if you look at indigenous societies, to me it seems like they live much more profound, meaningful, happy lives than we do. At less energy return on investment ratios. The question is, globally, will we get there? And the problem is, if you use fossil fuels, you have more power. All right, you have access to more energy, so you can shout louder. And like the things I'm saying, they have been said for decades. Like, I'm not the first one to get this. But the problem is that the people that support the status quo have fossil fuels backing, and so they have more energy to convert more people to their side. And so if you now go away from this talk and you say, okay, it was very interesting, but I'm going to fact check this, as you should maybe, you go, for every person that agrees with me, you'll find 10 people that say something else because they have more energy available, right? And so then on a collective global scale, it's very hard to see us moving away from fossil fuels before, as long as they are more powerful and better than renewable sources. And that's a bit the predicament that we're in, right? And it was there as soon as fossil fuels were there.
Okay, I don't disagree with that. Yes.
Yeah. But that means, I mean, for individuals, for us, we should do that. Like if you want to live a profound life, I mean, you probably should use less physical wealth and invest more time in human relations and relations to Earth, and like that makes sense, right? We should be doing that. It's just on a global scale, probably not enough people will do it. Right. Good.
I don't know if Annette raised hand or if I or
No, I was waving.
Waving.
You go ahead, Mia.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Sven, very much. I know that this is this costs a speaker. This is not a talk that is, even though you live with that and know that, like sharing it openly with people somehow exhausts. I know that feeling. And I wish that we could all give you a hug at this moment.
That would be nice.
I wanted to share that, like accepting that I cannot put into words, or that I cannot understand, or that I cannot even accept some things, is this very exciting limit that I come to when I hear things like this. But I think what is important, that it's the truth. Like, I agree with everything that you said. It's everything that you presented, including the end with like a kind of not the hope that is not there. I live by that for quite a few years now. But what I felt inside of myself, like one process, is that actually there is something in me that always wants to have the solution. And I want to do things in order to reach from A to B. And I want that B to be a success. So this bargaining kind of thing, that I will do all these changes, even like the most radical ones, I will be a really good girl, and then there will be a victory or something. But I realized at some point that actually that's so transactional from me. Like, it's really, I saw that I actually don't agree with that kind of approach. And I realized that what I feel is that there is no solution and we cannot fix this. And we don't even have a, like, we have to really completely change in order to sense where the possible solution is. And I realized that my first step is to accept that, and to, even though I don't think that we have the quick fix, that I choose my battles because I feel them, that they are like small or big battles, that they are something that is meaningful. And that's the place where then it makes some kind of sense. And that's what both Michael mentioned in a way, and you mentioned also, this, the question of, like, we have all this complexity, but I'm very familiar, or I'm trying to be very familiar with degrowth. And I see that there is all this complexity linked with the material world that is actually completely crazy. I'm trying to be very, like, to develop inside of myself this feeling for what is meaningful, and then grow that and nurture that and keep that in society and in my life as well. And to just let go of all of this, because I see that it's actually not, complexity is not like where life is. It doesn't have to be.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Part of it is in some other place. So that's what I wanted to share. It's an open, this is not the conclusion.
No, of course.
It's a process of thinking of these things that are very hard to feel and think about. But thank you very much, and everyone who was here.
Yeah.
I think
Thank you.
I think we need to draw to a so important, all of that.
All right. Thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording.
Yeah.